welcome. I'm Cristian Pătrășconiu, and I'm joined by Ben Wilson, the author of an amazing book, Metropolis, A History of the City, Humankind's Greatest Invention. Ben Wilson is a great historian. Mr. Wilson is the author of 5 previous and precious books, including What Price Liberty, for which he received the Thomas More Award and the Sunday Times bestseller. He has consulted for various TV historian programs. He has written for the Spectator, the Literary Review, the Independent on Sunday, the Scotsman, the Guardian. I'm so happy to be with you, Mr. Wilson. Welcome at Elephant Fest.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me start with this question. Is the city really the greatest invention of humankind, history?
Well, that's where I started from, that kind of idea that the city is invented. It's a kind of an invention that human beings made, that transition to urban life about 7,000 years ago. And really what urbanization does, that kind of collective, bringing minds together in a kind of collective, kind of hive mind kind of way, leads to all other kind of inventions. So if you look at the very first city, Uruk in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, very quickly after people made that kind of decision to live together, to live at density, and to release people from the labor of getting food and to use their minds, that's where the written word comes from. I mean, think of all the things that come from that invention. It's where money's invented. It's where modern mathematics, financial things, beginnings of trade. So in that sense, very little other inventions. Progress is very much dependent in human history on bringing people of different backgrounds, of different skills, and throwing them together into this kind of like a whirlwind of interaction in a city, and this constant shifting landscape of people coming in, people leaving, the demands for luxuries, for new foods, everything else kind of stems from that. And whether urbanization takes place in a big scale, like, you know, Uruk was a big place, it would be small for us, about 20, 30,000 people, maybe 50,000, or whether it's a huge city like Los Angeles, or whether it's a small scale, like a university kind of campus type urbanization, it's the same kind of thing. It's the bringing together of people. That's urbanization. It's a great invention, but there's also a dark side to it as well, because not only in Uruk did we get the beginnings of the written word, and good things like that, but we also get the beginnings of slavery, kingship, war. The complex society brings up lots of different problems. So, I mean, this book isn't just a celebration of cities as a great invention. It's a very important invention because it marks a transition in our cultural evolution from hunter-gatherer or agricultural societies to hyper-advanced societies. And my argument in the book is that when that happens, like Uruk at the very first city, or whether it's the Italian cities in the Renaissance, whether it's Amsterdam or London in the 17th and 18th century with the beginnings of modern financial capitalism, that innovation happens very quickly in the right kind of urban conditions. And that's what fascinates me is, how do cities make that change possible? And what does that mean, good and bad, for the rest of humanity?
Mm-hmm. How did you discover this idea, an extraordinary one, a history of the world as a history of the cities, of the metropolises, and how you were convinced that this idea would become a book, once again, an extraordinary book, different book?
Thank you very much. Well, yes, I mean, metropolis, the word metropolis from the ancient Greek means mother city. So the book is about this transmission of ideas from places. So whether it's Uruk, it starts in Uruk, or whether it's Athens or Rome, or wherever the places I found to land on as a subject matter, I wanted to talk about them, not just a potted, a little history of each city, but how those cities influenced the times they were in, how the things that happened in those cities kind of echo in a more universal, global kind of sense of what urbanization means. So, for example, I didn't want this to be a sort of straightforward start at the beginning and go through various cities. It's a book about what urbanization means. So an example of that in the book, I talk about, where I write about Rome, I write about the bathhouses, and the bathhouses as a place of sociability, and maybe a sort of, a big city, a city of 1 million people, the first city to kind of reach that extraordinary number, the first sort of big mega city. That bathing becomes, in the pressure of a dense, dirty, polluted city, bathing is important. And that led me to a more kind of, what is the relationship between not just sociability, where people meet in the baths and interact and talk, but also, throughout history, how do people wash? How do they keep clean? What is the purpose of swimming and leisure in cities? So this idea of, structuring this book was not just, here we start, here we kind of end up, how we start in a small city in Iraq and end up with big mega cities like Lagos in Nigeria with 25 million people. It's more about how do we survive the city? What does the city bring to us? It's in part, why are we attracted to the cities? And part of that is things like bathhouses, the sort of super luxury of Romans bathing in ancient Rome, marked them out from people who weren't urbanized. The pleasure of going and mixing with your fellow citizens and having this kind of luxury of living in the city, I thought was really important. And it's not just baths that I concentrate, it's things like food, all the pleasure, the sort of sensual, hedonistic pleasures of a city are what draws them towards them. It's not just their power and might and financial clout, it's this kind of experience of living in a city. But at the same time, how do we survive a city? And part of that is the ability to escape from the city, to escape from the kind of density and dirt of a city and go into a swimming pool or a river or the sea. So I thought I'd try and tell that story in a more innovative way. So it's much involved in the kind of markets, bazaars, sports stadia, restaurants, cafes, as it is in the kind of the grand public buildings, palaces or banks or government buildings, parliaments, whatever. So it's about that kind of, how have we as human beings gone from a sort of more natural lifestyle to a much more constrained artificial one, and how in that process we've learnt to survive and negotiate the city, which isn't an easy thing. And we keep having to find new ways to kind of to make the city a livable space.
Mm-hmm. What is the logic behind choosing that cities that mark the history that you propose? What is the logic? Why that cities, that metropolis?
Yeah, well, I couldn't do all cities in the world. There was a process of selecting it to choose. So I start with Uruk, which was a very obvious choice because it's the first city. It literally means the city. And I think not a lot of readers know much about ancient Mesopotamia, but I thought it was very important because a lot of the kind of, there's something very universal about people, or that story about how we move from, the countryside or, a life where we're more connected with nature to one which is much more artificial. And so every age has had that. And the Mesopotamians, I kind of look at the very first work of literature in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And a lot of that is about this tension between city and non-city. Have we made a horrendous mistake by going to a city which has historically shortened our lives? It's been a place of disease. So that was an obvious choice, and it allowed me to draw lots of other themes about what it is to live in a city. The other cities were sort of more obvious. It would be hard to write a history of urbanization without talking about Rome, just because it spreads its urban influence into parts of northern and eastern Europe where there were never cities. There was no sort of sign that urbanization was going to happen. There were big settlements in places like where I come from in England. There was no kind of idea of urbanization. It had to be imported from a Mediterranean culture to England. So I had Rome was important to talk about. Similarly, I wanted to talk about cities like, I wanted to broaden it out so it wasn't just a European story. So there's a chapter on Baghdad as this kind of linking thing, links the cultures of East and West, but also a place that linked food and cuisine. So it's a melting pot of ideas and philosophy and science. It's also a melting pot of food, and I think bringing those two ideas together, I found quite important. I wanted to write. I thought that London was important to write about in the 18th century because it was the first kind of modern metropolis in the sense that it had it was built around leisure, around theatres, pleasure gardens, these kind of half public, half private spheres. So it was a move away from the cities being based around the very public, the square, the plaza, the piazza, ceremonial spaces, to a much more what we would recognize as an urban experience, which is built around shopping and entertainment. But similarly, because it was such a vibrant, kind of exciting city I'm talking about in the 18th century, it was also where we get a lot of our ideas of the modern economy, the modern financial economy, the beginnings of insurance. And there's a link between the kind of the beginnings of capitalism and pleasure, because and food, because the beginnings of the insurance business, which underpins all kind of modern transactions, took place at coffee houses. It was people came together from lots of different disciplines, lots of different endeavors, whether it was science, whether it was long distance trade, banking, speculation, all different things. They met in a very sociable environment, which was the coffee house. And for us, that's a very modern kind of idea that coffee and cities go together. It didn't start in London, of course. It started in places like Constantinople and Smyrna, but it came to in the first country in Western Europe to have coffee houses was London, and it provided this tremendous forum of this kind of network of information exchange, which is what cities really are. They're information exchanges. And in London, it took place in coffee houses. So I wanted to talk about that sort of London story, but it was about how coffee is a builder of cities in a funny kind of way, which we nowadays with Starbucks and a kind of much more sort of cafe orientated urban culture. So it has a resonance for us now. It's kind of where, people sort of meet and come together. In another way, I wanted to talk about New York, but again, not New York as the sort of success to London as a kind of, as a big important center of capitalism and finance, but to connect it to the movies and how our idea of the dream city is very connected to how we see and experience cities. And so the cinema and the skyscraper started almost exactly the same time, and the movie camera falls in love with the skyscraper, and it presents this idea of the dream city of the 20th century to audiences all around the world, and makes the future, the New York represents the future and the kind of cities that people see as dominating the future, that our lifestyles would become much more aerial. We go into the sky and live in the sky. That would be the future. It's reflected in science fiction movies and aspirational movies. And I wrote about cities in war. Warsaw was very important. Is the idea of how resilient cities are against the most appalling things that are thrown at them in times of war. So Warsaw became my kind of example of a city that terrible things happened to, but had within it the capacity to rebuild, and that tells a much bigger story about that cities are so kind of durable that that they withstand all kinds of difficulties and punishments that come at them. So a lot of the cities suggested bigger ideas. If it led to a bigger idea, it told us something about their time, but also about our time as well now. So that was the logic, was to find the city that kind of told me something about the time. And that could be located in all kinds of places. So I locate some cities in the Indian Ocean in the Middle Ages. I take the story away from Europe, or it could be in the suburbs of Los Angeles in the 20th century, which sort of showed the kind of the beginning of the modern world of a much more dispersed suburban style of urbanization. And Los Angeles just told that story really, really well, but it kind of echoes to any city. So it's not, the idea wasn't about those specific cities. It was what those cities could tell us about our own cities. So they tell a bigger story than just their little sort of microcosm of their own time. It was, that was the logic that I followed.
Kind of concentration of the history of their time, like a large in a small, and a quintessence of their age.
Yeah.
Yes. Is it true that only on this day, when we are talking, when we have a pleasant conversation like this one, the population of cities around the world has increased by 200,000 people?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yes, it's a startling fact that we're living. Our age is characterized by a revolution in our species' history, which is kind of why I wanted to write this book. Because, yeah, I start the very first bit of the book is saying that today 200,000 people move to the city, or in some cases the city moved to them, because cities are growing so fast, they're swallowing up countryside, especially in Asia and Africa. We're going through a monumentally important time in our history, that the city is becoming our predominant mode of life. It was about 10 years ago that more than 50% of people lived in urban areas, for good and bad. And I think, we're living in a time where we've kind of fallen out of love with cities during the pandemic. That cities didn't become such a great place to be in. And there was a lot of talk that people would be leaving cities. But my argument is always, look elsewhere in the world, and much more importantly, it's where people are moving to cities. They're moving to cities in some of the most important biodiversity hotspots in the world. So this has enormous implications for non-human life on this planet. The city, because of the way it's expanding, cities around the world are going into very important rainforest areas, savannas, estuaries, river deltas, places that are sort of crucial to life on Earth. So we're urbanizing in a way which is going to become dangerous. And this book was partly to say that, that we talk about becoming an urban planet, but for a lot of people, it's a suburban planet. People are living on the edges of cities. And this book was a reminder that that actually living an urban lifestyle, of living close to where you work, living with a mix of people, living in a place with good transport links, living compactly and things like that, was actually a kind of was important for our sort of future development as an urbanized species, that to remind ourselves what's good and important and powerful about cities, and to try and sort of to look at how we can more smartly at how we can urbanize in the future, rather than doing it on a kind of colossal and very destructive scale we're doing it at the moment. Can
we imagine an entirely urbanized world after, let's say, 100 years? Is this possible?
Well, urbanization, whenever, people will live a more urban lifestyle whatever that happens to be. The proportion of people working in agriculture has fallen from 40-something% to something that's in the 20%, to about 28% of people. It continues to fall. And people go to cities, as they always have done, for opportunity. The rates of education, life expectancy are often higher. Ultimately, maybe not for the first generation, but for the succeeding generations. There's a lot of opportunities that people have in the city, and it is an escape from rural poverty. So when we talk about urbanization, it's not just the city. So to go to your point of will we live in an urban planet, we kind of already are to a certain extent, that the city exerts such a huge influence over the rest of the planet. Although we urbanize in a small percentage of the planet, the things that we need to keep cities going get bigger and bigger. The ecological footprint of a city is huge. It's a city like London. I only say that because I've got the figures to hand. What is it? It's the amount of global land that needs to support London is 180 times bigger than the city itself. Think of all the roads and transport links that go with urbanization, that keep everything going and feeding, the forests that need to be cut down. That's kind of what we mean by not everywhere will be city, but everywhere will be influenced by the city and our way of life. I mean, China has become a powerful, important country, not least because it urbanized at a terrific rate through the 1980s, 1990s into the 2000s. Kind of mass migration of people, hundreds of millions of people going to live in cities and enjoying a better standard of life, a growth of middle class, a desire for more products, more better food and things like that, changes the countryside. So there's a sort of double thing going on here, that we become an urban species. We urbanize the planet to a certain extent, but there is hope. I don't want to make that sound too negative. If we do live more compactly, if we find a way to do that, then cities can be, if they're designed well, can be less energy intensive. They need fewer resources in terms of transport, heating and things like that, than a more dispersed population. So more compact cities are paradoxically better for the environment, or can be, if we kind of make them a more sustainable thing. So a lot of this thing is that urban life can be sustainable if we want it to be. But that means we do have to live more in a more urban way, which is living at a kind of greater density, not being so, following the kind of the model I was talking about in Los Angeles, which was this kind of just everybody getting more land and the city just endlessly. If you've ever been to Los Angeles, it's a city that never seems to end. It just goes on and on and on. And that's a model that's has been followed as people get richer, they want more space. And that it sort of undoes the city. It sort of pulls the city apart because it's growing and people aren't living so close together. So you lose the advantages of density, but you kill the countryside, you kill the ecology that ultimately the city rests upon. So urbanization can be, if it's done well, it kind of goes back to what it was before. Cities will be the place where we can best survive climate change in a way, because we can adapt cities to climate change. We can make them, like citadels in the past defended us against sort of marauding armies. Maybe cities in the future can defend us against or mitigate the effects of climate change. But we have to do it. We have to do it better. We have to learn, what is the best form of urbanization that suits a time of climate change. And I argue throughout the book that the cities are very adaptable. They've adapted throughout history. Now there's a very pressing need for them to adapt to climate change.
Fundamentally, are metropolises, great metropolises, places of order or places of disorder?
Good question, both. I think that is the a lot of people, a theme of the book is that throughout history people have tried to impose order on the city. They've seen it as messy, out of control, unhygienic, and that's very true. The industrial city of the 19th century was a disorderly place in the sense that it grew very quickly when we industrialized and when people began to move en masse to cities. But there was the growth of cities, like it does in the developing world now, the growth of cities outpaced the infrastructure that was in place to deal with them. And for as long as there's been cities, there's been an attempt to design them better. From Plato, or before Plato onwards, there was this idea that we could design the perfect city. If you got the urban planning right, you'd make better people. You'd impose this order that you could design a city that brought the best out of people. Alexandria, the great city of the ancient world before Rome, was a pre-designed city, and a desire to impose order, to have a kind of a street plan that made rational sense. The modernist movement of the 20th century was a desire to undo the city that had been kind of left to just the forces of the free market and to individual choices. The modernist movement was a desire to rip out the kind of congested, dirty city and to have, a much more orderly plan of high-rise buildings, to get rid of the tangled mess of that history had kind of given cities. The garden city movement that emerges out of Britain and America at the beginning of the 20th century. Also, the City Beautiful movement was a desire to pull apart the city and impose a kind of rational order on it. Now, I contrast that with a city like Tokyo, which was being destroyed several times in its history, probably most famously by firebombing in the Second World War. Contrast that with cities in Western Europe, where some kind of rational order was imposed on cities, often with disastrous consequences. The same in the United States, the kind of horror story of inner city urban living. In Tokyo, they allowed to grow up by individuals and communities and neighborhoods. So it grew up incrementally from the ashes and destruction of the Second World War. And it became the most hypermodern city, paradoxically, of the second half of the 20th century, but built upwards from the foundations built by ordinary people. But its modernization was put in place sort of retrospectively. It was fitted into neighborhoods without kind of discriminating between richer and poorer neighborhoods, but it fitted itself around neighborhoods as they existed. So my take on urban history is that as human beings, we're very good at living in cities. We've adapted to them. We've adapted their needs to us. We've lived with mess and chaos, but we've imposed a kind of order on it. My kind of quintessential story is a place I went to in Lagos in Nigeria, which is a frighteningly huge, messy, out of control city. But there's a kind of order that people put in place. So there's a market called the Tiba Computer Village, which was started in the late 1990s, early 2000s by a few typewriter operatives that made the jump into repairing computers. Now it's the biggest electronics, software, computer developing market in West Africa with a huge turnover of billions. This is a sort of self-generating startup place where people went and learned from each other, did apprenticeships, and now Huawei, all the big kind of electronics businesses have to compete in this market where it's people who've started the businesses from scratch and operate on car bonnets or under umbrellas or in little shops and things like that. It's completely spontaneously driven. It generates huge revenues. It's done very well for people. It's got its own courts, its own management structure. All this comes from the sort of street upwards and has created a successful business. Now, for city planners, that's a nightmare because it kind of seems like it's out of control. So in Lagos, the government wants to take this very successful street marketing, creation of lots of individuals interacting together and put it in a business park. Now that's kind of tidying up a city. That's trying to impose some kind of order on it. But but will that kill the kind of the spontaneity that comes from the streets? Arguably it will. I think and that's my kind of, that kind of clustering effect of people meeting and interacting in a completely spontaneous manner has been what's driven urbanization from its very beginnings. And very often the attempts to impose things from the top down have have been spectacular failures. And we see all around throughout history these kind of attempts to build the dream city, the ideal utopian city. But really the most successful cities are the ones that we kind of know and love and want to go to on holiday, that have grown up. They're layers of history where people have used and repurposed buildings, where there's a mixture of kind of an overarching kind of planning. But the best kind of planning isn't one that predetermines the order. It responds to how people are shaping their own city. I mean, I can give you lots of examples, if you like, in the modern world of places where individuals have led urban change rather than the other way around. So I think that the order often arises spontaneously in cities. That we're thrust together. We shouldn't, as a species, we weren't built to live at such densities and things like that. But we were able to of adapting ourselves to it and coping with it. I mean, one example I'll give is going back to Los Angeles. It was designed as an expansive, built around the private house and the car, with very little public space. This was a place of people's homes. Now, in the late 20th and early 21st century, Los Angeles has become a majority Latino population. And the Latino population want to live in a very different way. That's much more of a communal, public way. And so places like the food vans selling tacos and that, things like that have become places of street interaction that Los Angeles never had before. There's a much more of a culture of street markets and parties in parks, the opening up of the private house to the street so that people can interact. So planners in Los Angeles tried to stop it, but now have accommodated themselves to do it. And the outcome is that some parts of Los Angeles are becoming so sort of vibrant and interesting that young, hip, creative people that work in the new tech sector are wanting to go back to those places because they feel more like cities and less like boring suburbs. So there's an example of how people can change their city from the ground up. And wise planners will kind of go, okay, we will harness that energy. We won't try and control it, but we will respond and we will keep, we'll keep the kind of the order of the city, but we won't predetermine what that kind of energy will be, because, cities are in a constant state of metamorphosis. They're constantly, that's what makes them interesting, is this constant turnover and change. And that's what I wanted to capture in this book, that cities are in this constant state of movement and evolution, metamorphosis that no planner can cope with.
But one more question, the last one. What does it mean to be a metropolitan? A metropolitan. Is there a negative meaning to this formula? To be a metropolitan.
To be metropolitan, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it takes on lots of different forms, but in its essence, I think it is. It's living in a place where you can encounter the unexpected. And I think that's where innovation comes from a lot of times. Some of the most creative, successful places whether in the modern world, whether it's Silicon Valley, is for the purpose. It's not a city. Silicon Valley isn't a city, but the Apple HQ was designed to be like a city where people bump into each other and mix. So I think being metropolitan is being in a place where you have access to other people often in surprising ways. You have access to culture, to public spaces where you can interact. I think the sort of the expansive modern sort of suburban way of living, the kind of big mega cities, often killed that thing that makes cities pleasurable because of the lack of public space, the lack of places to socialize and mix. I think that, you know, we underestimate how much of our success and innovation comes from things that aren't obvious. It comes from socializing and mixing. It's the sociability that comes from things that are unplanned and sort of arise spontaneously. And that's, you know, all great cities, I think, have got that. And to be metropolitan is to be given the opportunity, whether you're rich or poor, to be able to sort of design your own life, to design your own neighborhoods, and to have that sort of chance of discovering new ideas that can change your life, change the city around you, change your neighborhood. And I think that's the essence of being metropolitan, is living with that sort of freedom, but also that proximity to other people. I think that's at the heart of what it is to be a sort of metropolitan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ben Wilson, for this great conversation. It was a very big joy, a very big honor for me to have you in dialogue. Thank you for this book. Thank you very much again.
It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you so much.